Recently, the YouTube channel Metatron released a video titled "Was Nazism Left Wing or Right Wing?" The video approached the question using the US definitions of these political terms and concluded that neither label fully applies to the Nazi regime and suggested instead classifying it as a totalitarian dictatorship. As a German historian, yes, this is my accent, I have a few thoughts to add. While I understand that the video, which I of course link in the description, uses the American interpretation of these terms, I believe a European perspective could offer valuable insights. Metatron later followed up with a second video exploring whether fascism was left-wing or right-wing, which left me somewhat surprised, since he had already addressed this question in the first video.
Horseshoe effect. Extremes touch, even if, ideologically, when compared with communism, fascism is indeed right-wing.
In the second video, he arrives at a different conclusion than in the first one, but that's not the focus here. Today I want to share my thoughts specifically on the remarks about the Nazis. For the sake of clarity, my primary focus as a historian are the Middle Ages, not modern history. However, I also studied political science and have engaged with this topic academically from various angles. I am not aiming to refute Metatron's analysis in this video. Instead, I want to offer an additional perspective. While I don't agree with everything stated in the original video, and I will make some corrections, this doesn't diminish my respect for the effort that went into the production. My main concerns lie in the broader scientific discourse that emerged around these ideas. Incidentally, this critique also applies to the two major channels that have reacted to Metatron's video before I did. After World War II, the Allies described the Germans' attitude toward the Nazi era with a dark joke. It seemed that the Germans preferred to argue there was only really one Nazi, and fortunately that one Nazi was dead. As a schoolboy, I was fortunate enough to hear from the US interpreter of the Nuremberg trials who spoke at my school. He shared how even among the Nazi elite, this attitude was prevalent after the end of the Third Reich. The video in question repeatedly focuses on Hitler alone, which reminded me of that joke.
In Hitler's speeches from 1920s, he clearly established his idea of what National Socialism was going to be.
This raises an important issue. Can such a mass movement truly be reduced to its leader? Isn't Nazism also defined by how ordinary people lived and understood it? I believe it is. The way Hitler was presented and staged was meant to resonate with and be eternalized by the German people. I don't want to imply that Metatron's video deliberately reduces the Nazi regime to just Hitler, but I think it's crucial to highlight Nazism was a widespread societal phenomenon, not just the actions of one man alone. Let's now address the initial question. From a German perspective, the answer is fairly straightforward. The terms left and right have been used in Germany since the mid-19th century, dating back to the first all-German parliament known as the Paulskirchenparlament, which convened during the Revolution of 1848-49. The elected members soon formed groups which were named after the coffee houses where they met in Frankfurt. These groups also took their places in parliament with the left and right wings of the political spectrum sitting the furthest apart as they had the most opposing views. This physical distance had a practical purpose. It was in the chamber intentional to prevent clashes and ensure work could continue smoothly. From the presiding officer's point of view, the right-wing faction sat on the right side of the room and the left-wing groups, surprise surprise, on the far left. This seating arrangement has remained in place in Germany ever since. The political agendas of these groups became the foundation for what is known as right and left in the German political spectrum. For example, if you look at a photo of the Reichstag in 1932 as we do it right now, you will see the members of the NSDAP, the Nazi party, seated on the far right, allying themselves with the right wing of politics. Incidentally, the president of the Reichstag at the time was Hermann Göring, one of the leading Nazis. The Nazis didn't have to sit there, they chose to. Politically, the Nazis also aligned with the right. They found common ground with the DNVP, the German National People's Party, a conservative nationalist group with whom they formed a coalition in 1933, which ultimately brought them to power. Let's not limit the discussion to seating arrangements, although they hold significant importance in Germany. We are very aware where people should sit, believe me. The original video raised doubts about the right-wing classification of the NSDAP based on specific issues, particularly the Nazis' relationship with private property.
In 1937, Hitler had already established the fact that he would demand private industries to produce something that the state defined as being necessary. And they had two options. They either do it, which is great, or they don't, in which case the state will take control of that specific industry sector.
These doubts are understandable, as there are several aspects to consider to back this up. Jews and other enemies of the regime lost their property swiftly. Initially, the Nazis merely encouraged Germans to avoid buying from Jews, who were also German citizens. Please let not forget this. But by 1935, this was regulated by law. Additionally, the Nazi economy heavily relied on forced labor. The first concentration camps, such as Dachau, opened as early as March 22, 1933. Hitler wasn't chancellor for 2 months at this point. However, Nazi intervention in the private economy was relatively minimal. It wasn't until 1944 that German industry was required to switch entirely to war production. Even as late as 1943, Hitler was still focused on grandiose projects like the new capital Germania. The first 4-year plan, introduced in 1936, involved limited intervention in the private sector. Hitler informed the Wehrmacht they needed to be ready for war within 4 years, leading to a surge of orders for the industry from the military. When drafting this plan, Hitler relied heavily on the advice of private companies like IG Farben. In East Prussia, large landowners, primarily the former Prussian nobility, remained untouched by Nazi policy. It was the Russians, after the war, who nationalized their property. The Nazis had a more insidious plan. They aimed to drain the economy so thoroughly that Germany would be forced to wage war to replenish resources. Both the population and the industry were expected to push for this war. An illustrative fact is that by 1939, Germany accounted for 19% of global steel production, an astounding figure for a country of its size, second only to the US. Some believe the Nazis took competition in the military sector too far. Different branches of the Wehrmacht acted relatively independently, upgrading as their commanders saw fit, often advised by industrial leaders. This led to odd situations, such as the lack of radios on the Eastern Front, while a half-finished military useless aircraft carrier floated in the North Sea without aircrafts capable of landing on it. The Nazi high command ensured that the private sector retained a pivotal role, appointing so-called military economy leaders who were civilians from the industry to serve as liaisons. The original video also denied any connection between the Nazis and Christianity, citing Hitler's anti-Semitism.
I would like to talk about an argument that is the one that shocks me the most, and it's the claim that Hitler was a Christian. Now, of course, I'm going to debunk this. I'm going to do it by, quoting from Hitler's own words with his own letters, and then we're going to look at how he changed his rhetoric before and after he became chancellor and then dictator. But before we do all of that, let me just say this. Do you really think that the leader of the most anti-Semitic regime the world has ever seen would have worshipped Jesus of Nazareth? The idea that Hitler was a Christian is nonsense, and his ostentatious hatred towards Christianity wouldn't really work or go very well with, say, modern-day faith and flag right-wing Americans. Hitler's real intent towards the church was eroding the core doctrines of the Christian religion until there was virtually nothing left of its original function, in order to slowly substitute it with a puppet used for social control, which would also have followed with the confiscation of all the places of worship, something actually quite similar to what is happening today in China. So that alone doesn't really make me feel confident about, Hitler's Christian beliefs. Oh, and the fact that he shot quite a lot of Polish priests dead. There is that. You see, during the beginning of his political career, Hitler publicly expressed favorable opinions towards traditional Christian ideas. That's true. But later he abandoned them. Most historians agree that he was adversarial towards organized Christianity. Oh, and he also criticized atheism, so he had a bone to pick with everyone.
While it's true that Hitler, as the greatest anti-Semite in history, was unlikely to worship a Jew, the relationship between the Nazis and Christianity was more complex. At the start of the Third Reich, 95% of Germans were Christian, and many of them supported the Nazis, particularly Protestants who voted for the NSDAP at double the rate of Catholics. The Nazis even created a religious movement within Christianity, the German Christians, which won a majority in church elections in 1933. The Reich Concordat with Rome ensured the Catholic Church's continuity as long as it stayed out of politics, though the relationship soured over time. Papst Pius XII famously attempted an exorcism on Hitler from the far. But early on, the cooperation was clear. For a long time, many Germans had no issue reconciling their Christian faith with Nazism. Over time, conflicts arose as Christians began prioritizing obedience to God over obedience to the state, Hitler. This led to figures like Pastor Martin Niemöller, initially an NSDAP supporter, joining the resistance and becoming Hitler's personal prisoner for 8 years. Despite these tensions, the Nazis effectively reshaped Christianity to fit their nationalist agenda. Hitler's approach was pragmatic. He was indifferent to religion as long as it served his purposes. There was even a Muslim SS division later on. In one of his speeches, he said, "The national government sees the two Christian denominations as the most important factors in the preservation of our nationality. It will respect the treaties concluded between them and the countries. Their rights should not be infringed, but it expects and hopes that the work on the national and moral uprising of our people, as the government has set it as its task, will receive the same appreciation in return." In essence, as long as churches didn't interfere, Hitler saw no reason to oppose them. This arrangement was widely accepted in Germany. The day after Dachau opened, Hitler explained his stance. "By being determined to carry out the political and moral detoxification of our public life, the government is creating and sealing the conditions for a truly deep inner religious life." It's important to note that the cross seen on German war vehicles, the so-called Balkenkreuz, has no religious significance. It is simply a military identification symbol. In conclusion, Nazis were not initially opposed to Christianity and were often seen as allies of Christian nationalists. While this may be unsettling for many Christians today, it reflects the harmonious relationship that existed for much of the Nazi era in Germany. On another point from the original video, it's worth noting that Nazi healthcare policies didn't apply to Jews or concentration camp inmates and included programs like forced sterilization from an early stage. This fact should be mentioned. I think as educators, it's important that we tell about the horrors that happened. In sum, the Nazis were more right-wing than the original video suggests, especially when considering how they implemented their ideology. Nazi doctrine was rigid yet adaptable, evolving as needed, as seen in their embrace of technology and competition. but I wholeheartedly agree with the point that was made about the name. We should really put this argument to rest. Nothing I've said so far excludes the possibility that totalitarian dictatorship, as suggested by Metatron, might still be a more fitting description. I have some thoughts on this as well. First, I must note that I learned a different definition of totalitarianism than the one used in the original video.
What defines totalitarianism? Centralized authority, strength in the military, militarism with resources directed to domestic population, authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, systematic elimination of political opposition by violence, expansionistic foreign policies, and conquest through military.
I am referring to Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher who fled the Nazis and later studied both National Socialism and Stalinism in the United States after World War II. Arendt defined totalitarianism as a complete absence of the political. Under this system, rulers claim total control over every aspect of life, including the private personal sphere. Totalitarianism, in her view, is an escalation beyond authoritarian dictatorship because it governs all social relationships. Arendt identified only National Socialism and Stalinism as clear examples for totalitarian regimes, although some argue that Italian fascism should be also included in this category, though this remains controversial. This Hitler quote exemplifies what Arendt meant by totalitarianism, and yes, I'm aware of the irony in quoting Hitler frequently, even though I began by criticizing the tendency to reduce Nazism to just him. These young people learn nothing but to think German, to act German, and when these boys come into our organization at the age of 10 and often get and feel fresh air there for the first time ever, then 4 years later they come from the Jungvolk to the Hitler Youth, and there we keep them again for 4 years, and then we will certainly not give them back into the hands of the old class and class producers, but we will immediately take them into the party, into the labor front, into the SR or the SS, into the NSKK and so on. And if they have been there for 2 years or a year and a half and have not yet become complete National Socialists, then they come to the labor service and are ground there again for 6 or 7 months, all with the symbol, the German Spade, and whatever class and class conceit still exists here or there after 6 or 7 months, the Wehrmacht will take over for further treatment for 2 years, and if they return after 2, 3 or 4 years, then we will immediately take them back into the SR, SS and so forth, so that they will not relapse under any circumstances and they will not be free all their lives, and they are happy with it. What Metatron offers as criteria for a totalitarian dictatorship aligns more closely with our understanding of an authoritarian dictatorship, which doesn't extend to cover, for a lack of a better term, the total. I agree that Stalinism and National Socialism are close as totalitarian dictatorships, but can I simply accept the term totalitarian as a replacement as it was done in the video? My answer is yes and no. What bothers me is the reasoning for substituting totalitarian dictatorship for right-wing or left-wing ideology. To explain, I will show some clips from the videos.
I would say it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The reason people argue over whether Nazism was right-wing or left-wing typically boils down to their own political ideology and wanting to label it as not us, right? It's ridiculous to try and say left or right. That's a tactic that is used by people to argue that the other side is practically Hitler. The other side are Nazis, and that's just not a beneficial way to look at this. It was its own thing. And in the end, it was totalitarianism, it was dictatorial power, and that's what we really should be looking at it as, not left or right.
So, the people who are categorically stating it was left-wing, it was right-wing, are not answering to present a comprehensive analysis of policies, ideologies, historical actions, military interventions, economic, religious and social positions pushed by said regimes. They are just insulting the other side.
Yeah, you do see it. It's definitely a weaponization. You hear terms like that too. Not even just Nazism, but like fascism. I've heard people say that in like the modern election, both sides, like the other side's a fascist. Because you understand when people don't know the meaning of words, then you can purely use it based on context. And that also means that people can take it to mean whatever they think it means. And that's hard because words do have meanings, or they should.
Accepting the weakening of terms like Nazi can be dangerous if we allow terms to be devalued into mere political slogans, as it has already begun for totalitarian as well. We risk losing the precision needed for meaningful analysis. I don't believe it's wise from a scholarly perspective to let these words lose their rigor. Here's an example from the video.
If there were any form of identity politics similar to contemporary political discourse, of course the Nazis would have been against it.
It argues that the Nazis rejected modern identity politics. Yet in Europe, there's a right-wing radical movement called the Identitarians. This only makes sense if we preserve the original meaning of words. Here's a common definition of identity politics in Germany. Identity politics refers to the efforts of powerful groups, states, ethnic or religious communities to impose their ideas of social and state relations as universally valid, aiming to integrate individuals into the logic of domination. Since social systems alone cannot create identity, it is consciously crafted by ruling elites through symbols, myth, and rituals that resonate within society. The goal is broad consensus around identity politics. While this can include measures to support the LGBTQ+ community, as modern identity politics often does, it also applies to National Socialist ideology and communism. If we give up these concepts too easily, narrowing them to specific movements, we risk analytical blindness. Similarly, I don't think it's advisable to abandon the distinction between left and right. While extremes on both sides may resemble each other in their brutality and propaganda, there are still important differences. Stalin, for example, conducted massive purges in the Red Army between 1936 and 1938 as part of the Great Terror. These purchases claimed 9 out of 10 generals and 8 out of 10 colonels, severely weakening the army, which lost significant ground to the Germans after their invasion. Stalin's purges did cost the Red Army twice as many generals as the Second World War itself. This is why I struggle with the original video's claim that Stalin's Russia always prioritized a strong military. For Stalin, military loyalty was far more important than strength. Hitler, on the other hand, saw the military as a natural ally and didn't do purges, as evidenced by the fact that leading Wehrmacht officers attempted to assassinate him in 1944. While Hitler often clashed with his generals, he did not fear them in the way Stalin feared his officers. It was only after the failed 1944 assassination attempt that Hitler's attitude toward the military changed. Stalin, by contrast, appointed political commissars in 1941 to oversee his army, ensuring that every order required their signature. This level of oversight was unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. We have already discussed religion. The Nazis sought peaceful coexistence with churches, while Stalin, who had been forced into seminary as a teenager, had churches destroyed and icons burned in his early years. In 1922, while Lenin was still alive, Stalin confiscated vast amounts of church property, and in that year alone, around 2,700 priests, 2,000 monks, and 3,400 nuns were killed. The Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was placed under house arrest, possibly poisoned in 1925. Stalin only eased his anti-religious stance after the German invasion, and the new patriarch was not elected until 1943. By comparison, there are reports in the Vatican archives that Hitler considered kidnapping the Pope, disturbed by the Pope's attempts to try an exorcism on him from afar. This plot was allegedly stopped by SS General Karl Wolff, not out of religious sentiment, but because it might have destabilized German positions in Italy. Stalin's closest allies were in the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the secret police where he installed his hand-picked officials. By 1946, however, even Stalin found their excesses too extreme and reverted the organization to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, a department dating back to the Tsar. Heinrich Himmler dreamed that the SS would achieve similar power in Nazi Germany, but it never did. Recognizing these differences is crucial in historical analysis. When studying this period, we must ask, how was this possible? To answer, we must examine who allied with the Nazis and who reached out to the communists. Today it seems that many prefer to ignore these uncomfortable truths. Those who lean right politically often claim it doesn't matter whether Nazis were left or right. Meanwhile, those on the left dismissed what happened in Russia and the Eastern Bloc as not real communism. Both camps seem eager to absolve their own side of complicity. This brings me to the present and my final thought. Those who identify as Nazis, as indicated by the flags they carry, clearly align themselves with the political right in our times. The same pattern holds for the left, but since the original video focused on the Nazis, I will stick to that. This self-classification is even more evident in the context of the United States. The inevitable question arises, how should we address this? Should we tell these people that they don't understand what Nazism really is? Should we argue that their interpretation of history is flawed? In my personal experience, people who wave swastika flags are not usually open to such discussions. I would simply acknowledge that modern individuals have adopted the Nazis as a historical role model and placed themselves on the right-wing spectrum. Movements like Nazism continue to evolve and adapt to contemporary realities, a process that even began during Hitler's lifetime. This deserves consideration, especially when the question is whether Nazism in the context of 21st century US politics is a phenomenon that can be classified as left-wing or right-wing. Therefore, my conclusion is, in European politics, traditional Nazism is firmly part of the right-wing. In the US, it is more right-wing than left-wing. Today, people who identify as Nazis almost always position themselves on the right. It's understandable that other right-leaning groups would distance themselves from such associations. However, this raises the question of why the far right serves as an attraction point for those who identify with Nazism. And yes, this is equally relevant for communists and those on the left.
He was very ideological. It was not just about personal power gain, in my opinion. He had a worldview that he was actively installing. It's not like he got to power and then just stopped trying to craft this world. If that was the case, then he, after 1932, like it would be over. Like there would be no World War II. There would be none of these other aggressive actions because once he became into power, there'd be no need to do anything else.